All right, good morning, everybody. So we're going to transition into Chapter 18 right now. So Chapter 18 really focuses on quadratic equations and ways to solve them and what do they look like graphed. So what we're going to do is we're going to start off by solving some quadratic equations. And earlier in the semester, we actually learned one easy way to solve quadratic equations. So remember factoring, okay? So let's say I had a problem like x squared plus 5x plus 6 equals 0, all right? What was nice about this is we could factor this problem down into x plus 3 and x plus 2 equals 0. And then what we would apply is the zero product property, okay? And we would say that x equals negative 3, all right, and x equals negative 2, okay? But that's just one way that we can solve a quadratic equation, all right? There are other ways. So the other ways that we're going to learn are not difficult. One is actually more preferable than the rest. All right, okay, and you'll see what I mean when I get there. But let me write this out. Ways to solve quadratic equations. Okay. All right, and the first way we know is factor. Okay. Now the second way is what we call the square root property, which is the first thing I'm going to show you today. The square root property. Okay. The third way, which is, I got to be honest, students hate this way, is it's called completing the square. Some of you may have already heard of this before. Okay, let me write that word better, square. There we go. Look how pretty that is. All right, my handwriting is getting better on my tablet, I think. Completing the square. And then the fourth way, which I'll put a little star because this is the most preferred way, and this is the way that I think a lot of people would approach problems, is just to use the quadratic formula. So when you really take a step back and you look at this, we have 4 different methods on how to solve quadratic equations. 4 of them. It's up to you to decide how do you want to approach it, okay? Now, for like a quiz or an exam or something like that, I may be very specific and say you must solve this using the complete the square technique, okay? Because I want to see the work, all right? But I got to be honest with you. If I just say straight up solve this quadratic equation, I don't care how you do it. You can use method 1, 2, 3, or 4. So today, what we're gonna focus on in this lecture is we're going to focus on 2 and 3, okay? We'll come back to 4. 4 gets its own section. It's really simple to do, okay? So first, the square root property. Let's write this out. Now, this is our tool. This is what we're going to use to help us solve quadratic equations, all right? So if b is a real number, all right, and if a squared equals b, then a equals plus or minus the square root of b, okay? So this is a conditional statement, meaning you got to have the first part in order to do the second part. So what we need to make sure first, do we have a real number, all right? And a number squared has to equal that number that we're concerned with, letter b. If we have those two things, then we can rewrite our problem as a equals plus or minus the square root of b. Let me show you what I mean here, okay? We're going to use the square root property to solve x squared equals 16, all right? Very, very simple problem. Now, I know a lot of us out there in YouTube land and in my lecture, okay, a lot of us, and please watch, a lot of us would say, well, Mr. Float, x squared equals 16, I could take the square root of both sides, and that's going to give me x equals 4. And that is incorrect. This is wrong, all right? It's wrong. Here's why, okay? We need to apply this square root property in a very, very, very responsible manner. We have to add that plus or minus on the right-hand side of the equation. Now, some of you may be asking yourself, well, why do we have to add the plus or minus? Here's why. You remember, and I think it was back in like chapter 15 or 16. What if I would have done this? What if I would have subtracted both sides of my equation by minus 16 and got it equal to 0? Which is what we are very, very, very used to doing. Notice on the left-hand side here, I have, if it'll let me erase, there we go. I have x squared minus 16 equals 0, which is the difference of squares. Okay? That's the difference of squares. Which means I can factor this down into x plus 4 and x minus 4 equals 0. And hopefully now you see where the plus or minus 4 is coming into play. Because when I apply that zero product property and solve for each of these, I get x equals positive 4 and x equals negative 4. And that is why we get the plus or minus 4 there, okay? So you got to remember, if you want to use this square root property, hey, I'm 100% fine with that. However, you got to make sure that when you take the square root of both sides, you have to include the plus or minus, okay? You have to include that plus or minus, all right? Let me do one more example here, and then we'll transition into the next problem, all right? So let's look at 5x squared minus 50 equals 0, okay? Now, if we compare this problem to the previous problem, I want you to see something. Notice in the previous problem, that x squared term was isolated, which means when you approach this problem right here, you have to isolate the x squared. And why do you have to do that? It all falls back to this definition that I gave you, all right? If b is a real number and if a squared equals b, then a equals plus or minus the square root of b. In other words, right here, let me highlight it here for you. Notice that is isolated, which means I have to isolate, okay? So what I'm going to do is rewrite the problem. And then I'm going to add 50 to both sides to give me 5x squared equals 50. Divide both sides by 5. X squared equals 10. Now I apply the square root, the square root property. So I take the square root of x squared equals plus or minus the square root of 10. On the left side, the square root of x squared is x. And on the right side, I get plus or minus the square root of 10. All right. So I hope that makes sense for you. Okay. I hope that helps you out. Now, we have already been exposed to complex numbers. We've already seen stuff like that. So you have to remember that if I come across a problem such as this, notice my squared term is isolated. This is already isolated. All right, so I'll put a little smiley face. I can apply the square root property here. Just because I have that square root of negative 9, we know how to deal with that now. We know how to deal with that. Remember, a negative underneath a radical is the letter I. Square root of negative 1 equals I. So on the left-hand side, I get 5x minus 2. And on the right-hand side, I'm going to get plus or minus 3i. Okay? You got to remember that. So now, to solve for x, I add 2 to both sides. I get 5x equals 2 plus or minus 3i. Here's my number in standard form. And then to solve, I divide both sides by the coefficient in front of the x to give me 2 plus or minus 3i over 5. Or you will see some books, they'll write the answer as 2 over 5 plus or minus 3i over 5. Okay? All right. So, square root property is done. in terms of me showing you specific examples, only using that. Now we're going to transition into completing the square, okay? So what I went ahead and did is I already wrote out the instructions here. I already wrote out the steps. All I'm going to do is just copy and paste them. There they are. All right. So I'm going to just help you out with this. I'm going to show you how to do this, all right? So when we want to solve a quadratic equation in x by completing the square, now the thing we got to remember, all right, let me write this here. All right, is we want this to look like ax squared plus bx plus c, all right, equals 0, okay? Get my black marker out again. So step 1, if the coefficient of x squared is a 1, you automatically go to step 2. That is by far the best case scenario for us. So you got to look in front of the x squared. If that coefficient's a 1, we move right down into step 2. But if it's not, what we're going to do is we're going to divide both sides of the equation by the coefficient of x squared. In other words, you have to divide everything in the equation by whatever that number is, okay? Step 2, isolate all variables on one side of the equation, all right? Now, when we get to a problem, I'll show you what that means. Now, step 3, and what I'm going to do here is I'm going to highlight this step, all right? Because this is the completing the square step right here, okay? This is the completing the square step. So in your book, it tells you how to do this in words, but I think it's a little confusing. So I broke it down into just two little mini parts. Part 1, okay, part 1. You're going to take the number in front of the x term, all right? That the letter b, all right? You're going to take the number in front of the x term, and you're just going to cut it in half. You're going to divide it by 2, and then I want you to circle that number, okay? Then you're going to take that number from that step, all right? And you're going to square it, all right? So whatever that number is, you're going to square it, and what I want you to do is, since you squared it, I want you to put a square around it, okay? Now, step 4, we're going to factor the resulting perfect square trinomial and write it as the square of a binomial. Just write that down. I will show you what it means, okay? And then step 5, we're going to use the square root to solve for x, okay? All right. So let's go ahead and we'll start off with a relatively simple problem, okay? Make sure I got my black marker here. So let's do x squared plus 2x minus 4 equals 0, okay? And I'll just read the steps, okay? If I were you, I would definitely write those steps out on a separate sheet of paper. That way, every time you do the problem, you can refer to your steps as you navigate your way through it. So, step 1, if the coefficient of x squared is 1, go to step 2. Well, there we go. That's a 1. I'm loving life right now because I don't have to worry about dividing anything. Step 2, we need to isolate the variable terms on one side of the equation, all right? So right here are the variable terms that I need to isolate, which means whatever this is, the c term, I'm going to write down the c term. You got to move it to the opposite side, all right? So x squared plus 2x equals, what I need to do is add 4 to both sides. So let me write that here. I'm going to add 4 to both sides to give me 4. Now, I want you to notice something here, all right? I want you to notice. I put a big space right there. In fact, this is what I'd like you to do, okay? No matter what, as soon as you move this c term, I want you to put plus and a line. And on the right-hand side of the equation, I want you to put plus and a line, okay? You'll see why. You'll see where that comes into play, okay? All right. Step 3. So let me write out my steps here. Step 1. Step 2. Step 3. Okay, here's our complete the square part, okay? So what I'm going to do is I'll write this in red. We're going to take the b term, the b coefficient, which is a 2. So 2 divided by 2 equals 1. Okay? So that was our first part. All right? Now, our second part is to take this number right here. That's why I want you to circle it. And I want you to square it. So we know 1 squared is 1, and I want you to put a square around it. Okay? Now, here's the beautiful part about this, okay? The number 1 in part 2, this one right here, the squared 1, that number is going to go here and here, all right? So now hopefully you can see why I said put a plus space on the left side and a plus space on the right side, because you got to remember, whatever you add to one side of the equation, you have to add to the other side of the equation. So for step 3, I'm going to get x squared plus 2x plus 1 equals 4 plus 1. Okay? Now, step 4. Now this step 4, if you write down the steps like I wanted you to, it says factor the resulting perfect square trinomial and write it as the square of a binomial. This right here is a perfect square trinomial. Okay? Now, I'm going to factor this down into a square of a binomial. What that means is you have something squared, and inside here is going to be a... Man, I can't spell today. Inside the parentheses will be our binomial, okay? And what is that binomial? It's the easiest thing on earth. In fact, it's staring you in the face right now. You are going to write x. Whatever the variable is that you're looking at, that's what goes there. And what goes right here? Well, remember how I asked you? Remember I asked you to circle part 1? Whatever that number happens to be, that goes right there. Okay? Now on the right-hand side, 4 plus 1, well, that's just 5. Okay? So let me rewrite this real fast. X plus 1 squared equals 5. Okay? Now step 5. I'm going to rewrite. We're going to use the square root property to solve for x. And notice, this, it's already isolated, which is perfect for us. So what I'm going to do is take the square root of both sides. Don't forget your plus or minus. And I'm just going to reduce. So I get x plus 1 on the left. On the right-hand side, I get plus or minus the square root of 5. And then I subtract 1 from both sides to give me x equals -1 plus or minus the square root of 5. And there's your result. The hard part about this is the fact that it's just a lot of little steps. If you follow the technique outlined, you should be all right. All right. And what's awesome is you have a video that shows you how to move through the steps. Okay. There's another issue with this as well. Sometimes these answers, like -1 plus or minus the square root of -5, they're not good looking answers whatsoever. I mean, you have two solutions here. The first one is -1 plus the square root of 5. And then the second one is -1 minus the square root of 5. Okay? They're both ugly numbers. Okay? In fact, if I wanted to, I'll give you the decimal approximations for these. So just give me a second here. I'm going to get my calculator out. -1 plus the square root of 5. Well, that is approximately 1.24, rounded to 2 decimal places. And then -1 minus the square root of 5. Well, that's approximately -3.24. All right? So you can see these are not nice numbers. That's why we introduce you to factoring first. Because if I go all the way back to the start of this video, where I did that example for factoring. Oh yeah, here it is right here. Look how beautiful these answers are. X equals -3 and x equals -2. They're integers. And that's awesome. But now the problem becomes, well, what if they're not integers? All right? And that's where this completing the square actually comes into play, okay? So now that I've introduced you into completing the square, and I really took my time with it, what I'd like to do is I want to do another example, except I'm going to speed it up here a little bit, okay? So here's our second example. 2x squared minus 8x plus 3 equals 0, okay? So step 1, I notice that I have to divide everything by 2 because I have a number other than 1. So that gives me x squared minus 4x plus 3 over 2 equals 0, okay? And there's nothing I can do there. So I need to divide by 2, all right? Step 2, I'm going to subtract negative 3 over 2 from both sides, all right? Because I need to isolate the x squared minus 4, okay? So let's go ahead and let's do that. So minus 3 over 2, minus 3 over 2. So I guess what I'll do down here is, all right, step 2. That gives me x squared minus 4x plus space equals negative 3 over 2 plus a space, okay? Now, step 3, complete the square. And I always write this step out. Complete the square. All right? So part 1, I take the b coefficient divided by 2 and circle it. And then part 2, I take that result, negative 2, and I square it to give me positive 4, and I put a square around it. Now, I know that 4 is going to go on the left and right-hand sides of my equation, so I'm going to rewrite it. X squared minus 4x plus 4 equals negative 3 over 2 plus 4, okay? Now, step 4, I'm going to factor this. And what does it factor down into? Well, it factors down into the square of a binomial. The variable goes there. And this negative 2, all right, let me highlight the negative 2 so you know what I'm talking about. That negative 2 right there is going to go inside the parentheses, okay? It goes right there. And you've already factored it. You don't even have to actually, when you think about it, you don't even have to really factor it if you recognize what you have in front of you, okay? On the right-hand side, if I get my marker back out here, I have to add negative 3/2 plus 4, and that's going to give me 5 over 2, okay? Now I'm going to use my square root property, which is step 5. The square root, both sides of my equation. Remember to add the plus or minus. Now I simplify. I get x minus 2 on the left. On the right-hand side, I get plus or minus the square root of 5 over 2. And then lastly, I will just add 2 to solve for x. To give me x equals 2 plus or minus the square root of 5 over 2. Okay? Now, that is one answer. You have to remember, we don't like radicals down in the denominator. Okay? So sometimes books will go ahead and they're going to say, well, at this step right here, let's separate the radical symbols, okay? And then we're going to rationalize the denominator because we don't like those square roots. So that's what I'm going to do here, okay? So I get the square root of 10 over 2, all right? So let me just write, yeah, we're good. So now what I'm going to do is add 2 to both sides like I normally would. And that's going to give me x equals 2 plus or minus the square root of 10 over 2. All right? And if you want to take it one step further, you can actually add these together. All right? Because what I mean by that is this. Let me write it down here. 2 plus the square root of 10 over 2. You can add these together by finding that common denominator. So common denominator would be 2. So that's going to give me 4 over 2 plus the square root of 10 over 2, which is 4 plus the square root of 10 over 2. And the same would apply if you would put the minus sign there. You would still get the same exact result. Okay? You would still get the same exact result. So x would equal 4 plus or minus the square root of 10 over 2. Okay? So my suggestion is this. Read the question carefully and make sure you understand what they're asking you. Okay? If you were taking a quiz in my math lab and you were to put this right here that I'm circling and it marks it wrong, email me and let me know, and I will give you full credit for it. All right? I don't have a problem with that. All right? I'm more concerned with, can you get me the correct answer? Not, can you completely simplify this down to make the math gods happy? Okay? All right, let's look at another one here. We'll do one more. How about 3x squared minus 9x plus 8 equals 0? Okay? So step 1, I need to divide everything by 3. Okay? Step 2, we're going to add, or I'm sorry, nope, we're going to subtract 8 over 3 to both sides of my equation. And make sure you put the plus space. All right, step 3, this is complete the square. All right. So we take the b term and divide it by 2. Now, negative 3 divided by 2 is actually negative 1.5. But we're not going to write decimals. What we're going to do is we're just going to rewrite it. We're going to leave it like a fraction, okay? Trust me, you want to do this, okay? I know we hate fractions, but for now, you want to do that, okay? Part 2, we take our result from the first step and square it. So a negative times a negative is a positive. 3 times 3 is 9, and 2 times 2 is 4. We put a square around that, and we know 9 over 4 goes to both sides of the equation. So this is going to give me x squared minus 3x plus 9 over 4 equals negative 8 over 3, sorry, plus 9 over 4. Okay? Now remember, step 4, you got to factor this into that binomial. But that binomial is going to be x minus 3 over 2 squared. Where am I getting the 3 over 2, the negative 3 over 2 from? I always do that. Sorry, let me catch up. Where did I get the negative 3 over 2? Well, that's right there. Always, always, always. That's always going to be the case. Sometimes students have such a hard time with that. Okay? And on the right-hand side, we have to add those two fractions. So negative 8 over 3 plus 9 over 4 is going to give me negative 5 over 12. Okay? Now, I can already see I have a negative on the right-hand side. I know I'm going to get imaginary numbers here for an answer. All right? So, step 5, and this is the last step. Let's just solve this. Okay? So, square root both sides. Don't forget your plus or minus. All right. So off to the right-hand side, let's just completely simplify this, and then we'll write out what the solution or what that simplifies down into. So first thing I know, I get the I out front and the square root of 5 over the square root of 12. I'm going to separate them. Now I'm going to rationalize, okay? So I multiply by the square root of 12 over the square root of 12, okay? So that's going to give me I square root of 60, because 5 times 12 is 60, all right? Over, well, what is that going to give me? Let me see here. Well, that's going to be 12. Do you guys agree? Pretty simple. Now the question becomes, can I simplify the square root of 60? And you can. So the square root of 60, let's break this down. Well, that's going to be 10 times 6, 2 times 5, and 2 times 3. Or another way to look at this would be I equals the square root of 4 times 3 times 5. Okay? Oh, why did I write I? Sorry, square root of 60 equals 4 times 3 times 5, or 2 square root of 15. Okay? So I know this problem was this little simplification is very difficult. This is why completing the square is hard. Okay? So what I'm going to do is I'm going to come back all the way over to here, and I'm going to just piece all the information together. Okay? So we have x minus 3 over 2 equals plus or minus. Now, remember, we have the I, and then in the numerator, we're going to have 2 square root of 15, and in the denominator, we have 12. Okay? All right. Now, that's going to give me x minus 3 over 2 equals plus or minus I square root of 15 over 6, because 2 over 12 equals 1/6, okay? All right? So 2 over 12, let me highlight what I just did there. 2 over 12 equals 1/6, all right? So I'm going to erase that now, all right? Whew, okay, I'm sorry. One more step. We're going to add 3/2 to both sides. So x equals 3 over 2 plus or minus I square root of 15 over 6. Okay? And last but not least, we're going to find our common denominator. Okay, and we're going to add these two together. So 3 over 2 plus or minus I square root of 15 over 6. The common denominator would be 6. So I have to multiply the first fraction by 3 over 3. That's going to give me 9 plus or minus I square root of 15 all over 6 for our final answer. All right? So, on a number scale from 1 to 10 in terms of difficulty, okay, I would say this problem right here is, I would say this is a 9. This is a difficult problem, okay? Just one of those things you just got to, we have all the techniques, we have all the tools necessary to do a problem like this. It's just we have to be careful and we have to just navigate our way through it, okay? So here is the simplified solution, 9 plus or minus the square root of 9 plus or minus I square root of 15 over 6. In standard form, for complex numbers, because remember, we have complex numbers here. All right? The answer would be 3 over 2 plus or minus I square root of 15 over 6. Okay? Like I said, I'm accepting both answers. Just get me there. Okay? Just get me the answer. That's all I really care about. Okay? So I hope this helped. All right? What's nice, you have the video. If you need more practice or if you need me to do more problems, you let me know, okay? Email me. There have been a couple of us in the class that have emailed me, and I've emailed back. So all you got to do is just let me know, okay? And I will see you in the next lecture. Bye.